Well, today we are starting something new. Those aren't words you hear real often in our church, because you don't have to laugh. That wasn't a joke. Yeah, we do. We spend some time. We're thorough. We're going to start the book of Hebrews today. And so you're on the ground floor of something brand new, the book of Hebrews. I want you to open your Bible to the book of Hebrews. Now, I'm actually asking you to, this is sort of like we're going car shopping and I'm telling you, here's the car we're going to buy, but we're not going to get out, we're not going to get in it, we're not going to circle it, we're going to park in the parking lot and stare at it. Because when you start a new book, you have to start at a certain place. I am committed to that, the way I was trained. It's the way we're supposed to do this, and it's proper that we do it this way. Today, my sermon title is Hebrews 1, Introduction. And there's nothing sexier than an introduction to a book. Yeah, it is not all that glamorous, unfortunately, but it's good, it's necessary. It helps us to get the framework we need to have, so as we're working through the book, we get it. And I'm just going to tell you up front, Hebrews is a lengthy book. We're going to break it up in some chunks. We're going to interrupt with some Christmas stuff. We'll come back. We'll interrupt with a probably 6 or 7 week series on the Jesus the I Am and God is the I Am from Jesus' I Am statements in John's. And then we'll come back to Hebrews. You will not regret your diligence in Hebrews. It starts with an introduction, as all books do. It's going to go then, it's going to ease us into the water. And easing into that water, we're going to be talking about angels for a couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about the law for a couple of weeks. And you're going to be like, what is that all about? Wait for it. This is like one of those stories, if you're a reader, or a movie if you're not, where you spend the first 15, 20 minutes getting to know the characters, getting to know the town, and finally, you've been watching this for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or you've been reading it for 3 days, and you're trying to figure out, what is this even about? And all of a sudden, it happens. You see it, everything's connected, you know why it's connected, you start figuring out why that guy, why we introduced to him, and what the shortstop, the store owner has to do with this, and it all starts clicking. Hebrews is that for the gospel of Christ, in particular, Jesus as our sacrifice. There's no book in the Bible that does a more thorough job explaining Jesus as the fulfillment of the law than the book of Hebrews. As a result of that, and because of that, you've heard me reference the book of Hebrews a bunch of times, but I've never preached through it on a Sunday morning. And we're going to do that now. So quickly, our introduction. We are going to read verse 1. I do get to read verse 1 for you today. So, and I'll read several other verses as we work through. I'm not putting scriptures on the screen today because we're not technically working the text. I just want to walk you through my bullet points of introduction. And the first one is, Hebrews is what we call a Jewish epistle. A Jewish epistle. Some of you are thinking, well, what's a Jewish epistle? Some of you are thinking, what's an epistle? An epistle is a letter, and that's all it is, a letter from, typically in the Bible, it's going to be an apostle more than anybody else. It was Paul, written to a group. Romans is an epistle. Paul to the churches in Rome. Galatians, Paul to the churches in Galatia. James, not the brother of Christ, but servant of God, and to the churches scattered. So we have these epistles written from probably someone of great authority. And I say probably for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Typically, it is an apostle or what we would call an apostolic legate, someone that worked hand in hand with an apostle like Luke. Luke wasn't an apostle, but he wrote Luke and Second Luke, or as you know it, Acts. Acts is just Second Luke. He wrote a second letter and picked up where the first one left off. But Luke wasn't an apostle, but he was an important guy because he worked with Paul. So our epistles, these letters, we have 13 by Paul, 3 by John, 2 by Peter, 1 by James, 1 by Jude, and Hebrews. And we don't know who wrote Hebrews. We'll get to that in a minute. But these epistles are the heart and soul of the New Testament. These are letters written from a teacher to his students. And they're powerful. We get more theological content from epistles than anywhere else. Now, I said this is a Jewish epistle. What in the world is a Jewish epistle? Typically, epistles are thought of as the Pauline epistles and all the others. I like to break it down more than that. There are the Pauline epistles. Of the Pauline epistles, there are the pastoral epistles. But of Pauline epistles, you have, of course, John, Peter, James, Jude, and Hebrews. 5 of those are unique in that they are Jewish epistles. So what are Jewish epistles? That's a classification I think that we need to note, because these are epistles that are written to a uniquely Jewish congregation. Some of you are, because of my interest in Jude lately, are thinking of Jude. Jude is a Jewish epistle. Hebrews, James, these are Jewish epistles. And so of the Jewish epistles, Hebrews is the most unique because of several reasons. It's the biggest, but it is also one that is shrouded in the most confusion. So Hebrews, James, Jude, 1 Peter, 2 Peter. Those 5 books explicitly are noted to be written to Jewish people. And you're thinking, so what? Well, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Rome, Corinth, Thessalonica, Galatia, those were Gentile groups. Gentile groups had, and we are largely Gentile. I don't ever do a show of hands. One day I'm just going to say, if you're a Jew in here, raise your hand. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to call anybody out. But in our town, we don't have a large Jewish population. And I'll just tell you, in the church at large, we don't have a large Jewish population. But there are Jews who are believers. And in the early church, the Jewish population was the start of the church. The church began on the day of Pentecost with Peter preaching on the streets of Jerusalem, and thousands of people were saved on the streets of Jerusalem. These were Jewish people. These Jewish people were there for the Feast of Pentecost. At the end of the Feast of Pentecost, they all went home to all over the land, all over the world, Cappadocia, Galatia, Pontus, Rome possibly. We don't know how the church at Rome got started. It might have been the day of Pentecost. And so we end up reading these epistles. Some of those epistles to the Gentiles were actually churches started by Jewish populations in Gentile areas. And in fact, books like Romans, while an epistle and called a general epistle, it's not considered a Jewish epistle, there was a considerable Jewish population even in that church. But the Jewish epistles are written to audiences that have one thing in common. They all trace their ancestry back to Jerusalem. These were the ones in Acts, start the big church. Saul, by his Jewish name, we know him as Paul, his Greek name, same name. He didn't have his name changed. That's just the same name in different languages. Before Paul became a Christian, he was persecuting the Jewish church. In fact, Acts said that Saul successfully routed the entire church out of Jerusalem and only the apostles remained. Well, that church was 10,000 strong earlier in its history. And so 10,000 believers thrown all over the world. Where'd they go? Antioch, Damascus, and they went into Judea. Now, as we do our introduction today, Judea is important. And I'll talk about why in a minute. But the Jewish epistles are written to Jewish people who had a common historical bond. They are the people who came from what we call First Jerusalem. I call it First Jerusalem. It wasn't First Baptist Jerusalem. It wasn't First Methodist. It was just First Jerusalem. In fact, of all the churches in the world that called themselves First Church, they had the right claim to it. That was First Church. And so these who were dispersed, and we call it the diaspora, the dispersion, they were dispersed from Jerusalem. And by the way, one of the things Hebrews is going to teach us Something that I said all through the book of Habakkuk. We even made a bumper sticker. Ralph made a bunch of bumper stickers. Some of you have them on your car. God, what the bumper sticker said is, I've got this, -God. Hebrews is one of those. God's sovereignty is seen through this because these are people struggling. And Hebrews is going to deal with their struggle, and I'm going to walk you through that. It's too early to get into it now. But these Jewish audiences had peculiar difficulties. They had peculiar persecutions. The Gentiles didn't want them because they were Jews. The Jewish people didn't want them because they were Christians. And the pagans didn't want them because they were Jews and Christians. Who did they have? They had each other. That's about it. And a lot of them, after having been run out of town, they were also run out of their families in a lot of cases. And so the nature of that dispersion was we have Jews scattered all over the world, Jewish Christians, but a lot of them stayed close to home. You remember the Great Commission and the Acts reiteration. You will be my disciples in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Oh, look at y'all, man. Y'all a well-trained church. Jerusalem is the city. Judea, we'll say, is the county. It's bigger than it is, like, but yeah, in Texas, it'd be a county. It's that next rung. Jerusalem sat in Judea. Samaria was the next rung outward, but the point of Samaria was that's the step right before the Gentiles. You go from the Jewish center to the Jewish mass to the Gentile, the half-breed, to the Samaria, the half-breed, to the Gentiles. And that's the book of Acts. That's how it unfolded. Well, these Jews were that first circle. And when they got exploded, a lot of them went all over the world, but a lot of them stayed close to home, still in Judea, but they fled Jerusalem. That's pertinent. We'll get to that in a minute, why. So it's a Jewish epistle. Secondly, I want to talk about authorship. And the first thing, the main thing I say about authorship is unknown. We don't know. There aren't a lot of books in the Bible where we don't know the author, but there are some. And in the New Testament, that's Hebrews. In the Old Testament, we call the author of 1 Chronicles the chronicler. Poor guy out there somewhere. All he had to do was put, Ned at the end, but he didn't. So he's the chronicler, and he's probably maybe more than one guy even. But in the case of the book of Hebrews, we don't know who the author is. There are a lot of arguments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this gets real academic, and it's not particularly helpful. It's fun for geeks to sit around and shake fried chicken at each other and argue, but it doesn't do any real world good. Some people, I'm sorry? Yeah, well, a lot of people believe that. Yeah, is that you're honest, or you're just saying you've heard it? There you go. I'm not in that camp, but it doesn't matter. See, we're about to start shaking chicken at each other, and I just said we weren't going to do it. Some people think it was Paul. I'll tell you, the original thought was Paul, the early church. Not the early church, I should say, the recipients, but the earliest people that wrote about who it might be thought it was Paul. We found some good reasons that it shouldn't be Paul. It could still possibly be Paul. I'll explain why in a minute. Some people think Barnabas. It reads a little bit Pauline. The thing that's not Pauline about it is Paul starts all of his letters the exact same way with the word Paul. Yeah, that's how letters were written. And now I'll write you a big, long letter, and I'm like, man, I just think you're so awesome, and I'm so thankful for the good work you do. And you're like, who is this? You're flipping it over to the back, and you look. Their letters just started with Jeff. I'm like, oh, okay, I know who it is. And so Paul, to the churches at whatever, we don't have that here. Why? Paul still could have written it. But a lot of people think it was Barnabas. A lot of people think Priscilla and Aquila. Some people think Apollos. Clement of Rome is a heavy contender. Clement he's probably mentioned once in the Bible. If God wanted us to know, He would have told us. So in this case, I don't want to spend too much time on it because God didn't spend any time on it. And so we're being, the academic, people that we are and wanting to ask questions that aren't answered. We don't know. What can be known is this. The author is a man. He uses masculine pronouns and participles to refer to himself. He's Jewish. He uses statements that only a Jewish person could say. Verse 1 is one of them. Long ago and many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. If he says our fathers to a group that is a Jewish group, he's saying, I'm one of you. Our fathers are your fathers. Hebrews 2:3, we see he's a second generation believer. How do we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. That's a mark against Paul, by the way, because this person says, we heard the gospel from those who walked with the Lord. Paul heard the gospel on the road to Damascus as the Lord came to him. So that's a strike against him. Some people would argue that maybe Paul didn't mean it that way, and that's fine. We don't know. We're not supposed to know. He was a well-educated person. He clearly was fluent in Greek and Hebrew. He was possibly a Levitical Jew. That is, a Jewish man who was born from the Levitical tribe and would have been in the priesthood. That's a good argument for Barnabas and Paul, frankly. But we go back and we look at all the people who argue who they thought wrote the book. And they all have one thing in common. Origen said it most perfectly. His answer to who wrote Hebrews was, God knows. Go Origen. So, yeah, God knows, and that's the way it's meant to be. Our audience, we already talked about that, Jewish believers, not random Jewish people, but Jewish believers. They were relegated to the kinship of the author. They're described as the kin of the author. They were, said that again in verse 1, our fathers. There are no references to Gentiles in the book anywhere whatsoever. Every reference in the book is something Jewish. And by the way, one of the ways we know this is a Jewish epistle is all of the Jewish stuff in the book isn't explained. You come across this really Jewish thing that I would be spending 5 minutes explaining to you, it just says it and moves on. So clearly they already know. This is a strictly, it seems, Jewish congregation, not even a mixed one, it doesn't seem. And some people have argued maybe not even a congregation at all. Maybe just an open letter to Jewish believers to be disseminated. And frankly, some of the Jewish epistles work that way. Another thing about the Jewish epistles I didn't say earlier, it just popped in my head. They are diaspora related. They're either written from someone in the land to Jews in the diaspora, those who are scattered because of the persecution in Acts 6, or they were written from someone outside of the land to Jewish people elsewhere. It's connected in some way to the diaspora always, which you could have inferred that, but I'm just saying it directly. So these, again, were second generation. They heard by those who heard, according to chapter 2, verse 3. They were outside the land. These were Jews outside of Jerusalem, not necessarily outside of Israel, but outside of Jerusalem. And there's one thing that helps me think that maybe they were... You can think they might have been close by in Judea, but they were certainly outside of Jerusalem. Maybe they were even outside of Judea. But one thing that makes us know that they were not written, it was not written to the Jerusalem Jews, is chapter 12:4. It says this, in your struggle, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. That can't be true of the Jews in Jerusalem. Stephen, murdered. James the apostle, murdered. James the brother of Christ, murdered. By the time this book was written, there had been great outreach against the Jerusalem Jews, the apostles and deacons and whatnot. So this cannot be the central first church body still at home. This is outside of that. A lot of people think that these are Jews that are in Rome. Chapter 2, 3, and 4, note these Jews were evangelized by an eyewitness of Christ. Romans 1 and 15 note that the church at Rome was not evangelized by an eyewitness of Christ. So that makes it kind of hard to sell. Some people believe these were Jewish Christians in the churches of Judea, and that does fit the description. Again, I asked you earlier, Jerusalem, Judea. If I live here and I get thrown out of town, how far am I going to run? Well, only as far as necessary, probably. I'd rather not live in Houston, but I'd rather live in Houston than Dallas. And maybe somewhere in between Houston and Dallas, actually, for me, because I'm not a city boy. But the idea of being flushed out of Jerusalem, you can easily go into the countryside of Judea. That fits. That may well be our congregation. We don't know for sure, but it does seem that they were close enough to the temple compound for specific temptations we're going to deal with. They were in a Jewish enough area to be going through specific temptations the book's going to deal with. I'll get to that in a minute, but when I talk about 5 warning passages, each of those have to do with defecting back to Judaism. You're not tempted to defect back to Judaism if you live in Syria, if you're in Damascus. That's a Jewish thing, so it seems like they probably are still in the land. They're believers. 3:1 says, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. He calls them brothers. He says they share in a heavenly dwelling. At 6:9, in your case, I feel sure of better things belonging to salvation. The author writes the entire letter with the assumption that his hearers are true believers in the gospel. They've been believers for a while. Chapter 5 says, by this time you should be teachers, yet you need someone to teach you the basic principles. In other words, you've been Christian long enough, you ought to be teaching others, and I'm having to teach you instead. So they've been Christians a while. They are spiritually immature. They are persecuted. That's a big, big factor. Hebrews 10. We see, recall former days when you were enlightened. You endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes publicly exposed to reproach, affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison. You joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. Again, this is first church Jews. These people went through, you wouldn't believe. Since you knew that you had a better possession and abiding one, therefore don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. That really sums up this book. This book is a lot of explanation about the superiority of Christ. In fact, if I had to have a subtitle, and I do have a subtitle, I put that on the notes. No, that's fine. No, you ain't got to go back. The superiority of Christ is basically the subtext to the whole book. Superior to the angels. I put supremacy of Christ. I like that better. Superior to the angels, superior to the prophets, superior to Moses. It's all about letting these people know you're in the right spot. Don't go back. Don't go back, because that was one of their temptations. Quickly, we've got to talk date. I say quickly as though we haven't burned 20 minutes. I'm good. So all you guys back here on the back row, always talking smack about how long I preach. I got this. And we are on target. Date. When we look at the date here, we don't have a date given in the book. We never do, but we can narrow it down pretty good. In AD 96, Clement of Rome was still alive. Clement of Rome, by the way, is a guy that existed in the timeline of the apostles and Jesus. But he quotes the book of Hebrews in AD 96. So it had to be in existence by 96. By the way, 96, all the Bible had been written by a year or two. John had just finished writing his gospel, his epistles, and Revelation, his 5-book collection. But we know that it can't be 96. Timothy's mentioned in chapter 13. Paul led Timothy to the Lord around AD 50. So we now have between 50 and 96, and that's how we work dates. We look for clues of things that tell me it has to be here. We look at chapter 8, we see the Jewish sacrificial system spoken of. It's spoken of a lot in the book because that's a big subject in the book. It's how Jesus fulfilled the Jewish sacrificial system. In chapter 8, it's spoken of in the present tense. If he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest at all. Talking about Jesus, because he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He wasn't a Levite, and we'll get to that. But he says the priests offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Every verb there is present tense. So as the author writes the book, the Jewish sacrifices are occurring in real time. So what? So the temple was destroyed in AD 70. This now means it was written between 50 and 70, because after 70, that would not have been true. Chapter 10, likewise. Every priest stands daily to service, offering repeatedly. And in fairness, he does also speak of the priestly functions in past tense, but he only speaks of them in past tense when he's talking about that as the old law that's passed away, not the new law that's in effect now. The actions of the priest he always speaks of, and the sacrificial system in present tense. So 50 to 70 now. He argues that the old system is obsolete, but it's still in practice. 8:13, he says, speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. What is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Some people have interpreted that to be a prophetic hint at the destruction of the temple in 70. Maybe. I'm not sure. Timothy's release date is mentioned in 13:23. You should know our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes. Timothy was summoned by Paul to come visit him in Rome. And we know that Paul was released, he was imprisoned and released after Nero died, which was after Paul died, which is around AD 68. So basically, you put all of that together, we end up, because Timothy's release has happened, we think that this book was written somewhere between 64 and 68. 64 and 68. It's not a late book. It's not a particularly early book. It matters that it was written before the temple fell in 70 AD, and that's probably the biggest thing. Quickly, historical notes. Historical notes. This is the judgment generation. What do I mean by that? Matthew 12, Jesus does a messianic miracle. He heals a mute demoniac so that he could both hear and see, and he was normal. The Jews had taught that nobody could heal a mute demoniac because you can't talk to the demon, you can't cast him out. Jesus did it. Why did Jesus do it? Because they brought him one. Why did they bring him one? Probably to prove that he wasn't the Messiah, because they said only Messiah could do it. Well, Jesus did it. So suck on that. And then he basically did what everybody expected. And the people on the street said, could this be the son of David? Which is Jerusalem street language of, I think that's the Messiah. Which of course he was. He proved himself to be Messiah, to which the Jewish leaders said, no. It's by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, this man casts out demons. They called Jesus demon-possessed rather than the Messiah. To which Jesus pronounced the unpardonable sin, to which Jesus announced this generation was going to go down. Later in Matthew 23, he spelled that out. Olivet Discourse, he did the woes to the leaders. He talked about the temple being fallen down. And in the Olivet Discourse, as he and the disciples were walking by, he said, not one stone will be left on another. And then he went into great details about the judgment of Jerusalem. That judgment happened in 70 AD. Jesus had been gone 35 years probably at that point. But this book was written before that. Not long before that. I'm thinking 10 years before, 5 years probably before that. So as this book is being delivered, these are the people that will live through the fall of Jerusalem, the scattering of Israel, the destruction of the temple. But this book is not written like a book that happened after the temple was destroyed. It's not mentioned. In fact, everything that's mentioned, the temple is in full service. But this is that generation. Historical note 2, Jewish Christians are being persecuted. We'll deal with that more. But Ananias and Caiaphas, the high priest duo, Annas was actually the high priest, Caiaphas, his son-in-law, was sort of taken over. It's kind of like in American presidential politics. We have party system, but imagine we didn't have a party system. Imagine two guys are in the same party, and not only that, but you got daddy and son-in-law. Ex-president is daddy, common president is son-in-law. That was the high priesthood in Jerusalem. So Ananias had a lot of power behind the scenes. He wielded through Caiaphas. He was just too old to do it. That priesthood absolutely despised Christianity, of course. And they would ban any Christian from the temple, from the compound, and they would find any reason possible to come against Christianity. Christians were cut off from their families if they were Jewish. By the way, it was a lot easier to be a Gentile Christian than a Jewish Christian, because the Gentile people were pagans. And as a pagan, you show up at work tomorrow and say, I found a new God. All your buddies are like, cool. Let's have a party and we'll sacrifice to him. They didn't think anything about that. Jewish Christians were that if you believe Jesus is the Son of God, you're saying, I believe he's the Messiah, but the Sanhedrin already said he's not, and they killed him for it. You are literally standing against us. You are saying that you are no longer Jewish, and if you're no longer Jewish, we have to cut you out of our life. You can't come for Hanukkah. They're actually having Hanukkah, then I got to think through that, yeah. So you don't get to do any of the things that a good Jewish person gets to do. They couldn't communicate with their own kin. And historical note number 3. Changes from Judaism are highlighted in this book repetitively. And the idea of this book that you need to set your mind toward is everything you saw before Christ, I don't want to say was symbolic. It was symbolic, but it was typological. It was a form of what was coming later, a type of what was coming later. The temple itself was modeled after the tabernacle. The tabernacle was modeled after a vision God gave Moses. The author of Hebrews tells us that God has a temple in heaven that looks exactly like it. There are things you wouldn't know the way you know them except for Hebrews. The temple is modeled after where God actually dwells in heaven. Hebrews teaches us that. The priesthood is modeled after what Christ was going to be for us. In fact, Christ was going to be the high priest for us. The sacrifice was modeled after what Christ was going to do for us, or modeled before what Christ is the fulfillment of, is a better way to say it. Heaven is the fulfillment of the earthly tabernacle. Jesus is the fulfillment of the earthly mediator, the earthly priesthood, the earthly sacrifice, because Jesus in this book is going to be the priest, the high priest, the king, and the sacrifice. He's all of those things. All those things are what Messiah was. We see a new relationship with God, detailed. Now, not from afar off, not from behind the curtain, but directly accessing God. Not through a high priest only, but approaching God boldly. This is the language of Hebrews. Things that you and I take for granted because Hebrews is such a big part of our theology. In fact, I'm going to say this that I might have said next week. Scholars, theologians tend to think, and I am one of them that does, that of your New Testament books, Romans is king. More theology comes from Romans than any other place, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And Hebrews is second. Hebrews is number 2, shadowed only by Romans. As far as if you could only study 2 books in the Bible, start with Romans and then go to Hebrews, because it teaches us so much. Key terms quickly. Perfection is a key term we're going to see. We see that word actually in Jewish epistles. We see that word in James. But that word perfection doesn't mean perfect in the sense of being without sin. That's not possible. Teleao means to be perfect in the sense of having undergone what's necessary to be what is anticipated. It means complete, mature. We see it in chapter 2, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 10. That idea of things coming to a perfect time. We see the word ainos from aeon, what we would call eon, the idea of timelessness or everlasting. We see forever, similarly. We see heavenly, which is epranios. It's a play on Oranos, and it's the idea of epi, of, Oranos, heaven. We see heavenly often, 3, 6, 8, 9, those chapters. We see the word better, something better. Something was good, but now it's better. That's one of the arguments that's made consistently. Jesus is a better priest. He's a better sacrifice. He's a better this, better that. We see that in chapter 6, 7, 22, 8, 9. 6, 7, 8, and 9. There's no chapter 22. Theme is the supremacy of Christ. As I mentioned earlier, we start off many times in many ways. God spoke to our forefathers, but in these latter days, He spoke to us through the Son. That's where we kick in next week. And the first point is that Jesus is the supreme messenger, as it were. He's better than the angels. He's better than the prophets. And that means a lot to you and I. So let me end the way I've been ending. What does this mean to me? Well, today's a hard one. Today's hard to say, here's what today meant to you, because today I'm preparing you for where we're going. But today it does have meaning for you. I want you, if you are at all struggling, if you're at all sensing that your crowd around you is stifling you, persecuting you, and let me just be honest, let me tell you to be real careful calling yourself persecuted in our country. We just celebrated a fireworks show that probably cost $8 million last night, you know, and we think about persecution. We don't know what persecution is. Persecution in the modern age is, they blocked me on Facebook. You know, these people lost their home, lost their relationships with their family. They were excommunicated from their entire lives. Job, home, property. They were thrown out of Dodge and started over with nothing. Now, when you and I start facing that kind of persecution, we can feel a kinship with biblical persecution. Persecution for us is way different than that in our country today. It's getting worse. It is getting worse. It is becoming less and less likely that you will succeed in certain avenues of human life if you are an open, avowing, professing Christian. It is becoming more common in our day-to-day that if you're an open, avowing, professing Christian, and worst of all, one like me and like probably you, or you would have burst into flames in this church a long time ago, who says, I actually believe the Bible, every word of it. I believe that God is the creator. I believe, I'm not a naturalist. All of the things that you and I believe, well, let's just say you're not going to get elected into office beyond Fort Bend County. You might make it to Senate from the citizens of Fort Bend County. You're not going to be president. You're not going to be a judge. Because you're one of the crazy people who believes in a man in the sky and believes the earth is young and all this kind of stuff. You're a science denier. So we get that kind of persecution. We get mocked a little bit. And for some of us, it's a struggle. If that's you, you have a lot in common with the audience of this letter. And what this letter is going to do for us is going to be helpful for you. So be faithful through this series. Come and learn it together with us. And it's going to be substantive. We're doing a whole book of the Bible, First Baptist Needville style. So we're going to work every part of every verse so that we understand it thoroughly. But yes, I promise it'll be fruitful. So commit to this, and I think in your preparation, your commitment to this book, being present, hearing, studying along, I think that this book will help prepare us for a lot of what's coming, but for some of you who are facing persecution now, it'll even prepare you for dealing with what you have now. Overall, this book is written to people in suffering, calling them to stay true to their suffering. Don't try to escape it because you get out of the frying pan and into the fire. That's not what it says, but that's what it means. These who are wanting to escape, the escape they have, the original audience, is to start pretending to be a Jewish person again. This whole book is written that way. We've come out of Judaism. We've lost our home. Everybody hates us now. But I know that my sweet grandma, if I would just show up and do a sacrifice, show up and go to temple with her, pretend that some of the old stuff is still familiar to me. If I would just be a Jew again, I know she'd take me back. And if she'd take me back, then my mama would take me back, and then my daddy would take me back, and then maybe I could get my job back. And I've got a nice little piece of property that right now my brother is managing for me. I bet I could get that back. And you see how easy that could be. And that's There's a lot of language in this book that tells us that they're thinking that way. And the author, 5 times, 5 separate warning passages. One of them is so intricate, we're doing a whole series on it. 5 warning passages about turning back. So if you struggle with any kind of persecution, if you struggle keeping your hand to the plow, commit to this book along with us. Father, we love you and we thank you for being the good God who, Lord, who does persevere for us. And Lord, I pray that as we study this letter together, you will put in us a zeal for who you are, an appreciation for what our forefathers in the faith endured. And Lord, show us so much of that sweet, sweet gospel doctrine that is included in this letter that we don't see anywhere else. Flesh out our understanding of the gospel through this letter. So many times we've talked about these things, but to see them in context and to understand them as they're presented here is particularly special. And Lord, I pray that even now, while we've just introduced a book, there's only so much we can do introducing a book. Not a whole lot of meat, biblical, theological meat here today. We're rather setting the table. But you are the great God who speaks. And Lord, maybe today you've spoken even to someone through this introduction. We ask your will to be done, your purposes to be fulfilled in your church. We love you and pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. I invite you to stand.